Hello and welcome to Fundamentals of Cybersecurity CSCI150N. I'm Peter Keurig and this is Chapter 12, Wireless Security in Mobile Devices. In this chapter we will learn how to describe the different wireless systems in the U.S. today, detail WAP and its security implications, identify 802.11 security issues, and examine the elements needed for enterprise wireless deployment, and examine the security of mobile systems. The outline for this chapter is the introduction to wireless networking, mobile phones, Bluetooth, near-field communications, IEEE 802.11 series, wireless systems configuration, and mobile devices. Chances are each of you in my class either have a wireless network at home or at least some device capable of connecting to a wireless network. In order for that to happen, with all these different vendors and companies out there that make these devices, we need to have a standardized protocol. In this case, IEEE 802.11 is the series of protocols that are available for manufacturers to use to develop wireless devices. It's agreed upon specifications, capabilities in order for them to all work and interoperate together. Now, wireless networking is the transmission of packetized data by means of a physical topology that does not use direct physical links. So more specifically for us, when we're talking wireless, we're talking about using radio waves to carry the signal, either over public or private frequencies or bands. Then when we talk about Bluetooth, we're talking about short-range wireless protocol, typically used on small devices such as mobile phones to create what's called a personal area network. And we'll go into that in a little bit. Like our discussion on wireless devices, chances are most of you have a mobile phone of some sort. It uses the wireless application protocol. It attempts to satisfy the needs for more data on mobile devices, but is falling by the wayside as the mobile network capabilities increase. The need for more and more bandwidth has put carriers to adopt a more IP-centric routing methodology with technologies such as high-speed packet access, or HSPA, and evolution data optimization, or EVDO. Mobile phones have ruthlessly advanced with new technologies and services, causing the phones and the carrier networks that support them to be described in generations. So there's Generation 1, which are your big brick phones, Generation 2, which were like your flip phones, Generation 3 is when your smartphones really started to appear, and Generation 4 is where we're at pretty much today, with different variations of Gen 4, such as LTE. Since phones are doing more and more with data, there needs to be a way to protect that data. So here we have Wireless Transport Layer Security, or WTLS. It's an encryption scheme which encrypts the plain text data and then sends it over the airwaves as ciphertext. The originator and the recipient both have keys to decrypt the data and reproduce the plain text. This method of ensuring confidentiality is very common, and if the encryption is well designed and implemented, it is difficult for unauthorized users to take a captured ciphertext and reproduce the plain text that it created. WTLS implements integrity through the use of message authentication codes, or MACs. A MAC algorithm generates a one-way hash of the compressed WTLS data. WTLS supports the MW5 and SHA MAC algorithms. Then there's third-generation mobile networks. With the conversion to third-generation or 3G networks, we moved from the analog phone to the digital phone, and it greatly enhanced speed and lowered latency issues. This reduced the need for lightweight protocols to handle data transmission, and more standard protocols such as IP could be used. The increased power and memory of the handheld devices also reduced the need for lighter weight encryption protocols. This has caused the protocols used for 3G mobile devices to build in their own encryption protocols, and security will rely on these lower level protocols and standard application level security protocols used in normal TCP/IP traffic. Several competing data transmission standards exist for 3G, such as HSPA or EVDO. However, all the standards include transport layer encryption protocols to secure the voice traffic traveling across the wireless signal, as well as the data sent by the device. The cryptographic standard proposed for 3G is known as Kasumi, The modification version of it is Misty 1. Algorithm uses 64-bit block and 128-bit key. Multiple attacks have been launched against these ciphers. While the attacks tend to be impractical, this does show that the application layer is needed for secure transmission of data in mobile devices. WAP and WTLS can also be used over the lower level protocols, but traditional TLS can also be used. With the desire for anytime, anywhere internet connectivity, 4G networks were developed. 4G can support higher quality VoIP or voice connections, video calls, and real-time video streaming. 4G is based on IP packet switching. Bluetooth is a short-range, low-power wireless protocol that transmits around the same frequency as your wireless network at home does, the 2.4 gigahertz band. Its broadcast range is approximately 30 feet, and it is known as a personal area network. As you can see by the table here, as generations went along, they got much better in speed. They went from 764 kilobits to today about 24 megabits per second. Bluetooth is susceptible to a lot of different types of attacks. First off, there's bluejacking, which is a term used for sending of unauthorized messages to another Bluetooth device. This involves sending a message as a phone book contact, and then the attacker sends the message to the possible recipient via Bluetooth. Originally, this involved sending text message, but more recent phones can send images or audio as well. A popular variation of this transmission is of shock images, featuring disturbing or crude images. Bluetooth is a short-range protocol, and the attacker has to be within close proximity of the victim in order to be able to do this. Next is blue snarfing. It is similar to bluejacking in that it uses the same contact transmission protocol. However, the difference is instead of sending an unsolicited message to the victim's phone, the attacker copies off the victim's information, which includes emails, contact lists, calendars, or anything else that exists on the device. More recent phones with media capabilities can be snarfed for private photos and videos. Blue snarfing used to require a laptop with a Bluetooth adapter, making it relatively easy to identify a possible attacker. But blue snarfing applications are now available on mobile devices. The majority of Bluetooth phones need to be discoverable for the blue snarf to work, but it does not necessarily need to be paired. So in theory, an attacker can also brute force the device's unique 48-bit name. A program called Red Fang attempts to perform this brute force by saying all possible names and seeing what gets a response. Blue bugging is a far more serious attack than either bluejacking or blue snarfing. In blue bugging, the attacker uses Bluetooth to establish a serial connection to the device. This allows access to the full AT command set. GSM phones use AT commands similar to Hayes-compatible modems. So if they can get in there, they can do stuff with the connection. This connection allows full control over the phone, including the placing of calls to another number without the phone owner knowing. Fortunately, this attack requires pairing of the device to be complete, and phones initially vulnerable to this attack have updated firmware to correct the problem. To accomplish the attack now, the phone owner would need to surrender her phone and allow an attacker to physically establish the connection. Then there's Bluetooth denial of service, or DOS. It uses Bluetooth technology to perform a denial of service attack against other devices. In this attack, an attacker repeatedly requests pairing with the victim's device. This type of attack does not divulge information or permit access, but it is a nuisance. It's more importantly, if done repeatedly, can drain a device's battery or prevent other operations from occurring on the victim's phone. As with all Bluetooth attacks, because of the short range involved, all one has to do is leave the area and the attack should cease. Bluetooth technology is likely to grow due to the popularity of mobile phones and a number of devices that are coming out, like Bluetooth headsets and things of that sort. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. Near-field communications is a set of wireless technologies that enable smartphones and other devices to establish radio communications over a short area or distance, typically about 10 centimeters or less. This technology, although it hasn't seen a lot of use up to this far, is starting to get more use. You're seeing it in things such as Apple Pay or other smartphone technology where you can use it to pay at the different pay terminals or whatever by having the physical device near the terminal. This obviously will open up more areas for attack as it's implemented more with the next generation of cell phones. It might be susceptible to cloning or things of that sort. We'll see more as the technology progresses. The 802.11 protocol is an IEEE standard that was ratified in 1999, starting with 802.11b. This is the protocol that has enabled us to have all the wireless capabilities that we have today. At the time, it was a new standard. It was centered on sending and packetized data transfer over what was an unlicensed bandwidth at the 2.4 gigahertz frequency range. The standard launched a range of products that would open the way for a whole new genre of possibilities for attackers and a new series of headaches for those of us who do security on networks. This is a table of the different 802.11 standards that are out there. As previously stated, 802.11 started with 11b, but then 11a, which came out shortly after, used a different frequency range up in the 5.18 gigahertz range. The next generation after that, 11G, went back down to the 2 gigahertz range. What was interesting was in 11N, they combined the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz ranges to get better bandwidth and coverage. And then coming generations of AC and AD, we're going to see a higher bandwidth because we're going to be using higher frequency ranges. But the trade-off for that will be that the coverage area is going to be a lot smaller and it's going to require more extension because the higher the frequency is, the less range it's going to have. For those of you who are not too familiar with how radio frequencies and communication works, it's interesting to note here is the higher the frequency, the more data bandwidth you have because you get more peaks, bottom and top. Imagine if those of you who've done mathematics have seen a sine wave where it goes up and down, up and down. The more of those you have within a period of time, the more data you can transmit. So that's why in this chart you'll see that the next two generations are going to be 5 gigahertz and 60 gigahertz, which means you're going to get significantly more data to be able to be transmitted at those frequencies. But there comes a trade-off. The higher the frequency, the shorter the distance. And a good way to look at that is those of you who have listened to AM radio and FM radio. Your AM radios operate at a much lower frequency, and they'll go for miles. I live here in New Hampshire, and I could pick up radio stations on the AM band out of New York City, while those of you who listen to FM note that maybe after about 30 miles from the source, the signal starts to drop off. So there's a significant difference. The higher the frequency, the shorter the distance, but the more data, the more fidelity that comes through. Thus, AM radio, longer distance and lower signal quality, and FM radio, shorter distance but higher quality sound coming through. It's the same thing with your data. When we move to a higher data range, or frequency range, you're going to get more throughput with data, but you're going to have less distance that it'll travel and provide you with that bandwidth. 802.11 includes attempts at rudimentary authentication and confidentiality controls. Authentication is handled in its most basic form by the access control point, or the access point. It forces the client to perform a handshake when attempting to associate with the access point. Association is the process required before the access point will allow the client to talk across the access point to the network. Association occurs only if the client has all of the correct parameters needed in the handshake. Among them, the service set identifier, or the SSID, needs to be correct. As those of you who have home wireless networks know, you can turn it on and off and require somebody to have to manually type in the SSID in order for them to access your network. This SSID setting should limit access only to the authorized users of the wireless network. The SSID is a phrase-based mechanism that helps ensure that you are connecting to the correct access point. The SSID phrase is transmitted in the access point's beacon frame. The beacon frame is a 802.11 management frame for the network and contains several different fields, such as the timestamp and beacon interval, but most importantly, the SSID. This allows attackers to scan for the beacon frame and retrieve the SSID. Even when you turn it off, they do have means of finding the SSID. Then there's the wireless equivalent privacy, which is a protocol that attempts to secure wireless using the RC4 cipher stream and tries to encrypt the transmission through the air. WEP uses a 40-bit or 104-bit encryption key that must be manually entered on the wireless access point and on the devices that want to connect to it, and it doesn't change. So the longer you keep that phrase or password for the WEP, the key, the more likely it is that somebody can crack it if they're trying to use brute force. So by the time the industry realized that WEP was not sufficient enough to protect networks, the industry or the marketplace had already been well saturated with the devices that had WEP in it. So they needed to find a way to protect the Wi-Fi connections, and they came up with an idea of WPA, or Wi-Fi Protected Access. And this was a temporary fix or stopgap measure where they were going to create firmware upgrades for the devices that were already on the market while they implemented a new standard with the future generation. It still uses the WEP or WEP algorithm, but it adds the temporal key integrity protocol, or TKIP. TKIP employs a per packet key generating a new 128-bit key for each packet. This can generally be accomplished with only, like I said, a firmware upgrade to the system. So it didn't really cost anything to implement it, other than distributing the firmware. So let's talk about the temporal key integrity protocol. It was created, like I said, as a stopgap to replace the WEP protocol without requiring a replacement of legacy hardware. The breaking of WEP had left the Wi-Fi network without viable link layer security, and a solution was required for the hardware that was already deployed. So TKIP works by mixing a secret root key with the initialization vector before the RC4 encryption protocol is used. WPA TKIP uses the same underlying mechanism as WEP, and consequently is still vulnerable to a number of similar attacks. TKIP is no longer considered secure either, so if you're using WEP or you're using WEP with TKIP, you need to consider about moving to WPA2 in order to secure your network. Wi-Fi Protected Access 2 WPA2 uses 802.1x to provide authentication and uses the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES, as we talked about back when we were talking about symmetrical encryption key, as its encryption protocol. WPA2 uses specifically the block cipher of the AES. It's a significant improvement over WEP or WEP and WPA in the use of its RC4 stream cipher. Wi-Fi protected setup is something you might see on some of your routers that you have. You can set up a pin that allows any device that enters in the pin to be able to be configured and allowed onto the Wi-Fi network that you've set up. It is a network security standard that is created to provide users with an easy method for configuring wireless networks. It was designed for home networks and small business networks. It involves the use of an 8-digit PIN to configure the wireless device. WPS consists of a series of extensible authentication protocol messages and has been shown to be susceptible to brute force attack, especially because it's only an 8-digit PIN. A successful attack can reveal the PIN and subsequently the WPA-WPA2 passphrase and allow unauthorized parties to gain access to your network. The only effective mitigation for WPS is disabling the option on a wireless router. So as we just mentioned, WPA2 uses 802.1x as its means of authenticating the device that's connecting to the wireless network. 802.1x is an IEEE protocol that can support a wide variety of authentication methods and also fit well into existing authentication systems such as Radius and LDAP. This allows 802.1x to interoperate well with other systems such as VPNs and dial-up remote access servers. 802.1x does not use encapsulation, so the network overhead is much lower. Unfortunately, the protocol is just a framework for providing implementation, so no specifics guarantee strong authentication or key management. 3 common methods are used to implement 802.1x. There's EAP-TLS, which relies on the TLS to pass credentials. There's EAP-TTLS, works much the same as TLS, with the server authenticating to the client with a certificate. But the protocol tunnels the client side of the authentication, allowing the use of legacy authentication protocols such as PAP and CHAP. And then there's EAP MD5, which uses the MD5 encryption protocol to hash a user's username and password. So this next part is one of those acronyms within an acronyms things you hear about every so often. So let's start with Cipher Blockchaining Message Authentication Codes Protocol, which is CBCMAC protocol, which then has another acronym of CCNP. This is a data encapsulation encryption mechanism designed for wireless use. CCNP is actually the mode in which the AES cipher is used to provide the message integrity. Unlike WPA, CCNP requires new hardware to perform the AES encryption. So when the WEP and WPA was implemented in the existing routers that were out there, it wasn't capable of using CCNP. Basically, your next generation, the 802.11n version of the routers, where you start to see the WPA2 become available. And I think you saw some in some of the G versions as well. Then there's MAC filtering, which is a selective admission of packets based on a list of approved media access control addresses. They're often employed on switches and wireless access points. This method is used to provide a means of machine authentication. In wired networks, this enjoys the protection afforded by the wires, making interception of the signal to determine their MAC addresses difficult. In a wireless network, though, the same mechanism suffers from the fact that an attacker can see the MAC addresses of all traffic to and from the access point, and they can spoof the MAC address that are permitted to communicate with the access point. So typically there are 3 types of antennas that are used in Wi-Fi or wireless systems. The most common that most of you have seen are your home antennas. Sometimes they're visible on your home router, and sometimes they're internal, but they look just like walkie-talkie antennas or something of that sort hanging off of your wireless router. Commercial antennas, you've probably seen them in some office buildings or hospitals or something of the sort. They look like little boxes, usually on the ceiling. Sometimes they're round, sometimes they're square. But basically they're strategically placed throughout the building to provide maximum coverage inside the building. And then there's outdoor directional antennas. Depending on the type, they can look like basically a tube that shoots the signal in a single direction, or they could look like a dish. And if you go on YouTube, you can find some interesting videos on some homemade directional Wi-Fi antennas using Pringle cans and wire strainers. So antenna placements. First off, let's think back to the basics here. With the exception of 802.11a, which uses the 5 gigahertz range, all the others use a 2.4 gigahertz range. So keep that in mind. It's the same range as Bluetooth, and either way, looking at the fact that the radio waves are in the gigahertz, it means that you're going to have high data throughput, but you're not going to have a lot of range to it. So you need to think about antenna placement. So Wi-Fi by nature is a radio-based method for communications, as we've already stated, and as such uses antennas to transmit and receive the signals. The actual design and placement of the antennas can have a significant effect on the usability of the radio frequency medium for carrying the traffic. So where you put the antennas is going to make a big difference. So antennas come in a variety of types, each with its own transmission pattern and gain factors. High gain antennas can deal with weaker signals, but they have more limited coverage. And then wide coverage omnidirectional antennas can cover wider areas but have a lower level of gain. The objective of an antenna placement is to maximize the coverage over a physical area and reduce low gain areas. This can be very complex in buildings with walls and electrical interference, and other sources of interference and frequencies require a site survey to determine proper placement. I kind of mentioned on the last slide that sometimes you see them in hospitals, in the hallways, and so forth. Hallways are a good place to put these for the sheer fact that if the building is symmetric and you have if the hallway goes right down the middle, the gain of the antenna or the coverage of the antenna should cover equally to both sides of the hallway. Therefore, if you take into consideration what that range is through the walls to the offices on either side of that, the hallway makes it good. It provides a good coverage area. Then you have them spaced down the hallway based upon where the signals start to drop off and you want the next one to pick up. The other thing to take into consideration that they don't really talk about in the book is you don't want to place them too close to an exterior wall, because you don't want to broadcast more strength outside of your walls than you need to provide coverage for your folks inside, because then it gives somebody an opportunity to play with your network and see if they can connect to it, and it becomes a security issue. So you want a good enough coverage to cover as much space as you can inside, while having it drop off just enough that when it crosses out the exterior walls of your building, that it is weak enough that next to somebody literally standing next to the building, they're really not going to get a good strong signal to try to compromise your network. So the book discusses MIMO, or multiple input and multiple output antenna technologies, where the available antennas are spread over a multitude of independent access points, each having one or multiple antennas. And you've probably seen some of these routers where they have 4 or 6 antennas hanging off of them. So that's the earlier implementation of it. And sometimes it's not necessarily them hanging off of one access point. They may have multiple antennas spread, like using the analogy of that hallway, they might have maybe 4 antennas spaced out along the length of the hallway that actually works with one access point. Then there's Wi-Fi power, which are levels that can be controlled by the hardware for a variety of reasons. The lower the power is used, the less the opportunity of interference. But if the power levels are too low, the signal strength will obviously be limited. Access points can have power levels set either manually or programmatically. And this comes back to where I was talking about with where you don't want the signal to bleed out your exterior walls to the outside world. You can use power levels as a means of keeping the signal within your building, just strong enough to get to every place you want it without it going outside your walls. If you're going to do some of this for commercial purposes, installing Wi-Fi, you're going to want to do a site survey. There's software out there for developing coverage maps for complex building sites. You need to take into account a wide variety of factors, particularly walls. What are the walls made out of? How thick are they? And absorbent of the signal is it? So you should be able to take measurements on both sides of every wall radiating out from the where the access point is going to be, and predict how strong the signal is going to be. Interfering sources, is there a power source or something like a generator or a transformer nearby that's going to create interference? And how the floor plan is laid out. This all makes a big difference in how the signal propagates and moves throughout the building. Site survey involves several steps. So you want to map out the floor plan. You want to test for RF interference. And then there's testing for coverage. And then analysis of material via software that can suggest placement of access points. After deploying the access points, the site survey should be done again, mapping the results versus the predictions, watching signal strength and signal to noise ratios. So this is done mostly on the enterprise level. Just one note, there is a piece of software that I've used called NetStumbler, which I think it's talked about a little bit later in the chapter. Allows you to see Wi-Fi networks, both those that are broadcasting their SSID and those that aren't. And it uses the beacon frame to gather information about it. So I was deployed to a place for a period of time where I was living with a roommate, and we had trouble with our wireless network. We would get dropped from it and wouldn't be able to reconnect to it easily. And we were just feet away from where the wireless access point was, so we couldn't figure out why. So I used this NetStumbler software to scan all the wireless signals that were available. And what I found was we had 8 or 9 different wireless networks within range of our where we were living, and all the people around us were all using the same channel. Every one of them was set to channel 1. So what was really happening is the different competing wireless signals on the same channel were, what was happening is one signal might get stronger than the one that we were connected to, and so then our computers would try to connect to that network, and it'd be rejected because we have the right password, or our MAC address didn't match what was in their table. So what we ended up doing was we mapped out all the different networks within a certain radius of our place, and we decided to help everybody and give everybody assigned channels so that no channels would overlap anyone else. And what ended up happening was we solved a lot of other people, a lot of our neighbors' wireless issues simply by helping them guide towards the right channels and not having any overlapping channels. Translating that back to a site survey, it's going to be the same thing. So not only are you mapping the floors and testing for RF interference, you're looking to see if there's competing wireless networks in the area, and if so, what channels are they using, so you can properly plan what channels you don't want to use when doing your network. So let's assume that we are taking a commercial building and we want to allow guests who come in to be able to connect to our network for various reasons. All right. One of the ways that we can do that is using a captive portal. It refers to a specific technique for using an HTTP client to handle authentication on the wireless network. Frequently employed in public hotspots. Basically what happens is when you connect to the hotspot, it sends you to a web page in your browser where you have to do your authentication. You've probably seen this in hotels and airports where it asks for maybe a name and room number or something of that sort. Or it might ask you to put in credit card information to purchase time on the network. The access point uses the simple mechanism by intercepting all packets and returning the web page for login. The actual web server that is served up by the authentication page can be in a walled off section of the network, which basically, so what will happen is new connections will get a IP address that's in the walled off segment of the network, and they can't get out of that until they've authenticated. Once they have, they get reassigned a new IP address through DHCP, and they go ahead and connect to the outside world. With public Wi-Fi, even free open to the public Wi-Fi, it's still a good idea to set up security such as WPA2, even WEP in this case, when it's free, for the sake of providing security for your customers who are using it. So one of the issues associated with wireless transmission, obviously, is that it's subject to interception by anyone within range of it. So this makes it possible for others to intercept and read the traffic. So, for example, if you sit in an airport and you set up your laptop and you use a program that's available, you can capture traffic that's going through the air, and if it's not encrypted or not protected, it's going to an unprotected hotspot. You can see everything that's in clear text. So at the very least, if you set up WPA2 or whatever, and you give out a password or whatever for the users to use it, you're still protecting your users, because it creates that the connection is between the device and the access point that's protected. So they could all have the same password, but that doesn't mean they're seeing each other's traffic. They're only going to see the encrypted traffic because the session is encrypted separately for each connection. So we're moving from Wi-Fi to mobile devices. It's a similar principles to those of applicable to laptops and securing laptops should be followed when using mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets. Data must be protected, devices must be properly configured, and good user habits should be encouraged. First, start off with full device encryption. Just as laptop computers should be protected with whole disk encryption, such as BitLocker, in case the device is lost or stolen, you must consider encryption for mobile devices used by your companies or even just used by you personally. Mobile devices are much more likely to be stolen or lost, and you should consider encrypting data on your devices. Most of your operating systems for your phones have encryption, full device encryption available as an option. So remote wiping. This is a big one for me with our users when we do our user training. Even though we do a whole device encryption with our wireless devices, we still talk to them about remote wiping and how important it is that when they think they've lost something, the phone or whatever the mobile device is, they need to let us know as soon as possible, because the sooner we know about it, the sooner we can send out a signal and have a device completely wipe itself before the battery dies. And we'd rather do that and go through the hassle of reconfiguring and restoring the device than to have a device that's lost and misses out on the opportunity to receive that wipe signal. So, for example, let's say there's 1 bar left on that phone for a battery, and they don't tell you, and you miss that window and the battery dies. Then finally, when they do tell you that it's missing, you send out that signal. If that phone's not on and that wipe signal goes out, barring somehow that device is turned on later on by somebody charging it, that signal is lost and it will not wipe the device. Once that's the case, the device, yes, it's still encrypted, but now they have however much time they want to try to crack the encryption on that device to get to whatever data is on there. And with many mobile phones and devices now having important information such as personally identifiable information, maybe healthcare information if it's owned by a doctor, or somebody sends that important sales report or whatever to it. Maybe you're a politician, just to kind of poke fun at what's happened, and you're getting emails that have sensitive information in it. If it can't be wiped, then that data can be eventually exposed if that device is lost. Then there's lockout. I have not seen this on too many devices, but a user likely will discover in a relatively short time that they've lost a device. So a quick way to protect it is to remotely lock the device as soon as they recognize that it's gone. There are products available for it, but whether or not your enterprise thinks it's worth spending that money is another story. They might just choose to do remote wiping. It should be that the device should be automatically lock after a certain period of time and require a login. Now, remote lockout is usually the first step in securing a mobile device, and before going to remote wiping, if the lockout option is offered to your users. So chances are most of us in this class have a smartphone today. If we're into tech, chances are it's probably a Android or a Apple device. The reality is that all mobile phones now pretty much have the option to lock out the phone and require a PIN or a passcode to open it up. Obviously, the more complicated you can make the password or PIN code, the better. Some devices actually use things like facial recognition, or maybe you draw a pattern on the screen. So different ways you can do it. The important thing is having it so that it's locked, that if somebody picked up your phone, they couldn't just go straight into using your contacts or using your phone to do something that might be inappropriate. Another important thing is your GPS in your phone. Most mobile devices are capable of using GPS these days for tracking device location. Many apps rely heavily on the GPS location, such as Google Maps or any kind of Google search will use your current GPS location if it's available to bring up ads or searches relative to where you are located at that time. Obviously, you got mapping apps and traffic monitoring apps, and even apps to help you find your phone if you've lost your phone. Things such as paying for gas at gas stations, restaurants, and other business apps as well. Such technology can be exploited to track movement and locations of the device. So you can actually get optional software to track your kids if you give them one of these devices, to know are they going home after school or not, or are they really going to their friend's house and getting home before you do, and trying to maybe lie to you or something like that, and they didn't go to their friend's house. Whatever the reason for that. But GPS can become an issue, both in privacy and can be manipulated. Once again, this is where devices, depending on what device you're using, whether or not some of these options are available to you. So for example, storage segmentation. I work for the government and we use BlackBerry. You can laugh or whatever. I don't know what your feelings are about BlackBerry, but one of the things is that their storage is segmented. So there's a unsecured storage that I can put personal stuff or whatever, and then there's an encrypted storage that is meant for official emails and text and whatever to be saved. And so it's automatically segmented on the phone. This becomes extremely important when you're doing BYOD, bring your own device, because you don't necessarily want your corporate data to be stored on a person's iPhone or whatever in an unprotected space. So you're going to want to segment out that data storage if possible, depending on the type of phone that they're having. Some companies have developed capabilities to create separate virtual containers to keep personal data separate from corporate data and applications. For devices that are used to handle highly sensitive corporate data, this form of protection is highly recommended. To be honest, I would go beyond that. I would say it's highly recommended not to allow BYOD, and only to, if they're working with really sensitive information, to provide them with a phone or device that is dedicated strictly to dealing with that sensitive information, so that the entire device is securely locked down. Then there's asset control. Because each user can have multiple devices connecting to a corporate network, it's important to implement a viable asset tracking and inventory control mechanism. For security and liability reasons, the company needs to know what devices are connecting to its systems and what access has been granted. Just as in IT systems, maintaining a list of approved devices is a critical control. But you want to know who has tablets, who has phones, and any other devices that are connecting to your network. So the term mobile device management, MDM, began as a marketing term for a collective set of commonly employed protection elements associated with mobile devices. When viewed as a comprehensive set of security options for mobile devices, every corporation should have and enforce an MDM policy. The policy should require 1. Device locking with strong password or PIN, 2. Encryption of data on the device, 3, device locking automatically after a certain period of inactivity. 4, the capability to remotely lock the device if it is lost or stolen. 5, the capability to wipe the device automatically after a certain number of failed login attempts. And then the capability to remotely wipe the device if it is lost or stolen. One of the things we're seeing is that more and more of the MDM capabilities are starting to be built actually into the operating system of the phones themselves, of the devices themselves. So that's like I said with the BlackBerry, I have that capability to be able to remotely wipe. That's built into the operating system. I have the same thing with a Windows phone that I have as well. So there are plenty of options that are starting to incorporate into the operating system, so you won't necessarily have to get an MDM software package to do it. Some other mobile device concepts. There's device access control. The principles of access control for mobile devices need to be managed just like access control for wired and wireless desktops and laptops. This will become more critical as storage in the cloud and software as a service becomes more prevalent. So emergent tablet mobile devices sharing tends to provide the user with seamless data access experience across many devices. So, for example, I have a Windows tablet and obviously Windows computers, and I use Google Drive as well as OneDrive, and both of them integrate into my operating system as if they were actual drives on my device. And I can access the same files from my desktop computer and my tablet computer with any network connection and seamlessly access them, regardless of which system I'm on, as long as the client is installed on it. Then there's removable storage. Because removable devices can move data outside the corporate controlled environment, their security needs to be addressed. So removable devices can bring unprotected or corrupt data into the corporate environment as well. All removable devices should be scanned by antivirus upon connection to the corporate environment. Corporate policy should address the copying of data to removable devices. Many mobile devices can be connected via USB to a system and used to store data, and in some cases vast quantities of data. This capability can be used to avoid some implementations as data loss prevention mechanisms. So, for example, cell phones, iPods, iPads, they can all be used as basically just like thumb drives as storage devices. We actually saw this when I was deployed overseas in the military. People would save files to their iPods and they'd lose them, and they'd wind up in some street vendor selling used ones. We would find actual iPods with people's files on them. So we implemented a policy, a GPO, that prevented people from saving to anything that was attached as a USB storage device because of that. And likewise, if you're working in an environment, a business environment that works with sensitive information, maybe it's working for a hospital or a research firm or something of that sort, and you have valuable information you don't want people to take outside of your organization by putting it on their own device, you'd want to put down some kind of a GPO or a policy that prevents people from plugging in a thumb drive, an external hard drive, or a phone or whatever into your computers and saving information to it that they shouldn't be saving. Then there's disabling unused features. The more features you leave on, the more vulnerable your device is. So with all the computing devices, features that are not used or that present security risks should be disabled. So for example, Bluetooth access is particularly problematic. We've already discussed some of the attacks that can be used on Bluetooth. It's best to make Bluetooth connections undiscoverable, and then users should receive training as to the risk of Bluetooth, not so that they avoid Bluetooth, but so that they understand what they should do when they do use it, and then when they're not using it, they should be turning it off. I myself use Bluetooth a lot. My phone integrates into my car very well with a lot of features. I use a Microsoft phone, and I have a car that has the Microsoft Sync, and so therefore I utilize the two to the most of their capability, and so I have to be aware because it does make my phone susceptible if I don't turn it off when I'm not in my car. So I make sure I turn it on and off as I get into and out of my car. So we've kind of touched on the topic already of BYOD, or bring your own device. Permitting employees to bring their own device has many advantages in business, and not just from the perspective of device costs. Users tend to prefer to have a single device rather than carrying multiple devices. Like, I have to carry 2 phones, and I don't necessarily like that. Users have less of a learning curve on a device that they already have an interest in learning, and plenty of other things. Where there's issues that come out of it is, first off, data ownership. So if it's their device, but they're downloading emails, let's say, from your mail server because you're sending them on their device, is that data still yours, or do they now own it because they've saved it onto their phone? Storage segmentation, which we talked about a couple slides back, is your data being mixed with their data, or is it segmented out and properly protected? Is it encrypted? Support ownership. So if there's a problem with the device, who helps them with it? Is that person on their own to figure it out, or does your help desk provide assistance with their device? And because of the number of devices that you would have, is your help desk capable of supporting those number of devices? Patch management. How are you ensuring that the users are having their phone operating system and other software properly updated and patched? Are they using antivirus on their phones? When I do my new user training and I talk to people about smartphones, one of the first things I do is I ask everybody in the class who has a smartphone, which is usually almost 100%. Usually 1 or 2 might not have it, but when I ask them how many are running antivirus, I'm lucky if one hand goes up. So is there antivirus available on that phone or mobile device? Forensics. If something happens, if there's malware involved, or you believe there's been data theft, who has the right to conduct forensics on that phone? Privacy. When you do go to do forensics on the phone, or you need to fix that phone, what level of privacy can the user of that phone expect? So you need to make sure that's being addressed with the users as well. Onboard cameras and videos. I'm going to see about putting a link on our page to a study that was done by the Naval Warfare Research Center. They created a piece of malware that runs on a phone that allows you to turn on and off the microphone and the camera to record video and audio on the phone without the user knowing that it's being done. In addition, they were able to use the movement sensors within the phone to map out 3D in a building, map out a building in 3D, which has a lot of implications to it. So now you can figure out when a person goes into a certain place in a building, maybe 1 hour each week, that's probably a meeting, and that's probably time you want to start recording, because that's where more important stuff is discussed, is in meetings. You'll know where the person is on a day-to-day basis. And not only that, but the clarity of the cameras these days on the phones, when you're walking by with it on your hip and the camera is exposed to where you're walking, they were able to take photographs of things like memos and pictures on the walls of cubicles and find enough detail that you could read the things that were on it. Then there's the onboarding and offboarding of people at the company. So what happens when a person goes to leave the company? How do you ensure that the data that is related to your company, emails and things of that sort, has been properly deleted off that person's phone? Adherence to corporate policies. How are you ensuring that people are following the policies that you've set in place? How are you ensuring that they're doing the patching? How are you ensuring that the data that they're saving is saved to the right place on the phone, and so forth? User acceptance. Is the person willing to sign to allow their device to be used for businesses if it comes at the cost of some of their privacy? And architectural and infrastructure considerations. So, how is the device going to incorporate into your wireless network within your business, or are you just going to use their cellular service to provide their data coverage for the bring your own device? And then legal concerns. It goes beyond just who owns the data on that phone, and so forth. What if the person sent something inappropriate in a text message or whatever, and they're using that phone for both personal and business use? Are you going to be held liable for it? And then there's plenty of other examples of legal concerns, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of good that bring your own device can do, and there's a lot of problems that bring your own device can also produce. So I started to allude a little bit to this first one here, location services and geotagging. That's basically your photographs, putting in the GPS location of where the photograph was taken. By default, it used to be turned on automatically in all the phones. I'm starting to see that most phones coming out today have it turned off, but really it's best practice to go and check and verify that it's turned off. You don't want to give away necessarily the location where all your photos are being taken. To be honest, there's a lot more that you need to be concerned with too. Should you really be posting photos of you sitting on a beach in Hawaii or something like that when you're on vacation, and now posting it out there for people to see, and they can validate that you're there and know that you're not home at your house? You're leaving yourself open for all sorts of crime to happen on your home. Things like being able to track where your kids are and things of that sort. These are all things that have actually happened in the past. So you want to keep these into consideration with geotagging. Mobile application security. So you want application control. How are you controlling what devices are allowed on your mobile devices? What applications, are allowed on your mobile devices? So, for example, if it's BYOD, you really can't tell people what they can and can't put on their phone. So that becomes an issue with software licensing. Are you responsible for them putting unlicensed software on the phone? Malware, if they install something, there's a lot of free stuff out there in these app stores, and I always tell my students that there's nothing for free. If you're getting something for free, then you are the payment. Something about you, something you have, is what they're seeking as repayment for what they're giving you. Because these companies and the people who develop the software is spending a lot of time and energy to develop the software. They're expecting something in return. Key and credential management. So whatever, if you're using mobile keys to encrypt the device and the passwords, how is it all being managed? Authentication. How is it being authenticated to access the device? Application whitelisting. What applications are you going to allow on there? Encryption. Once again, are you doing full device encryption? And transitive trust and authentication. All application concerns you need to be thinking about. I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig for Nashville Community College. Thank you for watching.